Okay, let me see if I can address a couple of the issues. And so in the Earth's interior PowerPoint here, we're trying to show how we can divide up the Earth into a couple different layers. And so one of the ways that we define the different layers is by composition. And so those are kind of the big terms, the crust here, the mantle, and the core. And so what we would argue is that the crust here is made of different material than the mantle is. So there is a compositional boundary at the base of the crust where there's a transition in composition from the crust and into the mantle. Then the mantle is this fairly thick part of the earth, and then it runs into some different material. This would be the core. And so there's a boundary here between the mantle and the core, and that is also a compositional difference. And so we can kind of discuss that crust, mantle, core, different compositions. Now, there is something when we look a little closer at the surface. One is that there are two different types of crust, even though initially we just define everything as the crust, this uppermost layer. There are two different types because they are also a different composition. And so if you look at this close up here, you can see that there's oceanic crust and there's continental crust. So oceanic crust is fairly thin, and you can see it represented by this thinner layer right here. And it's, on average about 5 kilometers thick. And then over to the right here, you can see the continental crust. That is a little thicker. It's about 30 to 40 kilometers thick on average. Now, even though the oceanic crust, which is, if we drill down, if we went in the ocean and we dove down and touched the bottom, that would be the top of the crust. And then we could drill down 5 kilometers and we'd be through that crust and into the mantle below it. We would have to obviously drill a lot farther if we were on the continental crust because it's thicker. But even though the oceanic crust is a different composition than a continental crust, there's still a compositional boundary at the base of each of them, because that is different. The mantle is different composition than both the oceanic crust and the continental crust. And so that crust-mantle boundary is still valid. It still runs right along here like that. Now, when we look a little closer and we're focusing on the surface here, or near surface anyway, we also want to define the Earth in what we're going to kind of call the behavior of the rocks. And so that idea is that the crust here and the top part of the mantle are going to behave in a similar fashion. They're both going to be brittle. They're colder, and so when there's stress applied them, they behave in a brittle fashion. They break, they fracture. And so that boundary where you have a change in behavior, where the material goes from being what we call brittle to what we might call ductile or plastic, where it actually can flow over geologic time, where if I applied some pressure to it, it would actually flow. Think about like some clay or silly putty or something. If I squish it, it doesn't break. It actually squishes and flows away very slowly, still a solid, but it has the ability to flow, so it behaves differently. So I'm going to make a boundary where the behavior of that material changes. And so I'm going to call the rigid part, this part that's brittle, I'm going to call that the lithosphere. And then below that, I'm going to call that material the asthenosphere. Now, I think some of the confusion is when you look at this big diagram here, and even in the smaller one, the mantle is pretty thick. You can see it runs from here all the way down to here. And they're calling this part here the upper mantle. So about 660 kilometers down, the upper mantle. And so sometimes I might have interchanged that upper mantle and said upper mantle for the base here of the lithosphere. So sorry for that confusion. What I want to say is that the part of the mantle that is in direct contact with the crust here is behaving the same as the crust. And so the very top part of the mantle that's in contact with the crust is part of the lithosphere because of its behavior. The crust and this part here both behave in a brittle fashion. And so because of that, we're going to name it something different, the lithosphere. And then below that, where the behavior changes to a more ductile or plastic kind of behavior, we're going to call that the asthenosphere. And both of those, the asthenosphere and this part of the mantle that we're including in the lithosphere, is included in this kind of area here called the upper mantle. So that might be where some of the confusion lies. when we looked at the one here that's closer, you can see this term upper mantle is applying to both the rigid part and this kind of more plastic part. And so what we're calling the lithosphere is crust. Doesn't matter if it's continental or oceanic. The mantle that's in direct contact with it down to a certain depth, depending on the temperature that we see as we go down into the earth. So that material, this very top part of the mantle and the crust together are called the lithosphere because they both behave the same, brittle. And then below that, there's part of the mantle that is plastic or ductile that can kind of flow slowly over geologic time. We're calling that the asthenosphere. All of that is included in the upper mantle. So I know it can be a little weird, and sometimes the terminology maybe isn't as clear. So that's what we're referring to as the lithosphere, maybe the rigid part of the upper. So this part here that's rigid or brittle is what's included in the lithosphere. And here, here, the weaker part of the upper mantle, the part that's plastic, is considered the asthenosphere. So hopefully that helps. Maybe this can help a little bit too. You can see how the mantle is fairly thick. And so when we're talking about the mantle and you're using the terms lithosphere and asthenosphere, we're only talking about the top portion of the mantle. And so here this green dashed line is separating the mantle into two parts. The brittle part, which is this kind of, I don't know what color that is, brownish stuff, from this orange stuff. These are both considered the upper mantle, the top part of the mantle. But the part of the mantle that's in direct contact with the crust is behaving the same as the crust in a brittle fashion. So we're calling that the lithosphere. Then below that, there's a portion of the upper mantle that's behaving in a ductile fashion where it has the ability to flow over geologic time. We're calling that the asthenosphere. And then there's more lower mantle down here. All right, so hopefully that helps. But if you need more help, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. All right.